The Remittance Men. This is another article by our favourite author, Fiona Timms. And she starts off by saying, Scott, since we've been discussing white people in South Africa who have fallen upon hard times, I thought this would be appropriate. On my rides, when I crossed over Nunu Stream, as my cousins had named it, when they came to spend a month at Wakefield every summer, it was filled with little water insects, which we tried to catch using a sieve purloined from their kitchen. I was faced with a choice. On the right, the red-hard packed mud road that led up a steep hill to Wakefield House, and on the left, a big rusty metal gate that opened up onto a track in the veld and led through fields below the house, and eventually to Stonycroft, the next farm along in Inhlizani Valley. Right next to the gate on the left was where the wattles grew thickest. There is nothing spookier than a wattle plantation as, to start with, the trunks are all pitch black, and their densely clustered little leaves are very dark green. They grew as thick as hair on a dog's back, and even on the sunniest day managed to shut out all the light, creating a sense of gloom. Now, I just want to show you a little clip of a praying mantis that visited me today. It actually came to the front door, and it was sitting there when I just stuck my head out to see what is happening outside in the world. Let's have a look at that very quickly. Goeiedag! Good day, fellow South Africans. I found this most beautiful praying mantis. Have a look at those colours. Isn't that gorgeous? It looks like a bit of gold. It was just outside my front door. I'm going to let it free now, so I'll be right back. Okay, getting back to the story. Silence added to the eeriness. In the bush, at any time of the day, there were bird calls or the clattering of dove wings as they fluttered about in the treetops. Even the chatter of monkeys or murmurs from a troop of foraging baboons gave the impression that the place was alive with creatures. But here, because wattles are an alien species from Australia and a monoculture, nothing else can grow with or under them. They render the ground and their surroundings sterile and provide no food for indigenous wildlife. So there in the deep shade there was eerie silence. At night, especially when the mist came down, threading through the wattle trees, there was no place more terrifyingly spooky. Of course, we never went out at night, unless it was driving home from a polo tournament, and I watched the wattle plantations from the safety of the back seat of the car, giving myself thrills of terror as I imagined what it might be like to be out there by myself. The chill, silent, pitch-black night, the sinister trees, and the fact that there could be big wild animals such as leopards lurking in amongst the midst that swirled around the coal black trunks made me shudder with horror. Even now in broad daylight when the sun was blazing down, riding through the cool, dark shade of the wattles, left me feeling cold and uneasy. To add to the sinister atmosphere, there were, to the left of the gate, the remains of a hut called Billy Hempson's hut. The ruined hut, just a short walk up from the river, had young wattle saplings growing out of it, which gave me the creeps, especially as I knew the story behind it from Grandpa. Billy Hempson had been a remittance man in the early 1940s, approximately 10 years before I was born, during the time that my grandparents were running the farm, while my father dropped bombs on the Italians in North Africa. Remittance men were the black sheep from well-off and often aristocratic families in England, who, when their wayward antics became too much for their parents or siblings to bear, were given a one-way ticket on a steamship to the colonies such as South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Even India and Malaysia had their remittance men. Filth was a common acronym for these pariahs, meaning finished in London, try Hong Kong. These outcasts, now and again, there were women who'd blotted their copybooks too, were given regular sums of money, but never enough for the return journey, to stay in their allocated colonies, too far away to be stirring up any more scandals on their home turf. In my grandparents' time, there were several remittance men in our district, and it was through Grandpa that we learned the history of the Hampsons. Billy and his brother. Sometime in the early 1940s, they had arrived at Wakefield, which was as yet unclaimed territory. They were two young Englishmen who had been educated at an expensive public school, still well-spoken, but with long bushy beards and wild hair, and with them was a boy of roughly 10 years old, the same age as I was now. He must have been Billy's son. They built themselves a wattle and daub hut near the Umgeni River, thatched it with long grass from the hillside, and settled there, living on brown trout they caught in the river, with flies they made from guinea fowl feathers. The two men and young boy twisted wire snares to trap scrub hares in the veld and small antelope, like blue duiker, in the bush. Occasionally in the dead of night they stole a goat from the Zulu kraal on a farm across the river. They would slit its throat, bring the carcass back across the river, skin and butcher it, and put it in a big black three-legged cast iron pot they'd brought with them when they arrived from God knows where to stew over an open fire. They spent their days lying up in the dongas or gullies, reading novels brought by the travelling salesman, and shooting haddidas, those big raucous ibis, for the pot. My grandparents only heard about the goat episodes through the travelling salesman. This was a man who came all the way out to the scattered ranches in our district, riding on the seat of an ox wagon full of books, which he sold to the farmers. Both my grandparents were prolific readers and bought vast quantities of his stock. On the bookshelves at home, amongst numerous other books of all descriptions, we had a set of American illustrated Bible stories, which had been bought from the salesman, and these had brightly coloured plates of beaming little boys and girls who had dropped to their knees in roads and muddy fields, and who prayed earnestly to Jesus, their tiny hands clasped together, their faces raised to heaven, and their eyes tight shut. The boys wore short shorts and white ankle socks, and the girls all had neat, tight pigtails or plaits, short dresses with pinnies, and white ankle socks. Both my parents were atheists, so these Bible stories were a total mystery to us girls. After paying our farm a visit, the travelling salesman continued on down to Umgeni Poort, which was a cattle ranch before the Catholic Church bought it for the nuns, and finally Wakefield, where the road eventually petered out, and where the Hampson brothers had built their makeshift mud hut. He parked his wagon full of books, turned his team of 14 oxen out to graze next to the river, and spent a night or two there. According to Grandpa, he was more than surprised to be offered a supper of goat stew, and after the brothers had imbibed a few slugs of brandy from his stock, was told the source of the meat. As I rode my pony along the track through the wattles, I tried to picture the three men, the Hampsons, dressed in tattered khaki with homemade shoes, veldschoens made from buckskin, sporting their wild bushy beards and long hair, and the more fastidiously turned-out salesmen. They would be sitting around a campfire, smoking their pipes, drinking brandy from tin mugs, and talking, while the thin, raggedly dressed boy sat with them, gnawing on a haunch of goat meat. In order to collect their remittance money, Billy Hampson and his brother had to ride on horseback, 18 miles to the Nottingham Road post office, which was just a tin-roofed shed, with a front stoop held up by 2 wooden posts. They owned, or borrowed, 3 small, shaggy Basutu ponies, which they saddled up on payday, and taking the 10-year-old boy with them, rode off at first light to make the long trek to the post office. Once they had collected their money in cash from the postmaster, wired there by their parents, It was just a mere couple of 100 yards across the railway line to the Nottingham Road Hotel, where there was, and still is, a thriving and very busy bar called Notties. Now, I remember Notties, because Notties and Nottingham Hill was literally just down the road from Michael House. And because I used to run a lot, I used to run right up to Nottingham Road. And this tiny little town, or it's more like a little village, very quaint, beautiful, beautiful location. Anyway, later that night, when the two men had eventually been thrown out by the bartender who wanted to lock up and go to bed, they would be uproariously drunk, and most of their remittance money would have been spent. The small boy had to somehow load them back onto their ponies and, mounting his own, lead them both on a long rein. He would have to go slowly and carefully in case one or both of the now semi-comatose men fell off, plodding home in the pitch dark. His ride would have taken him hours, all the way back beyond our farm and Umganiport, and eventually down to their hut next to the river. I don't know if the young boy had any sort of lantern, not according to Grandpa anyway, but he had to ride, unarmed, with those two dead drunk men slung sideways over their saddles through Lion's Bush. The area was no longer infested with lions after farmers like Great-Grandpa had shot them all. The last lion shot was back in about 1846 by a Boer settler, Gert Maritz, who owned the farm called Lion's Bush. He was the brother, or cousin, no one seemed to be sure, of Piet Maritz, who founded what used to be called Pietermaritzburg, now Umgungunglovo. There is a well-known story that Maritz and some of his pals shot 5 lions before breakfast one morning in the vlei below Lion's Bush. There were, and still are, certain leopards about. Every rustle in the grass in the pitch dark of his long, long trudge of a ride home must have made the small Hempson boy jump with fright. My grandmother, on hearing all this from their Zulu herdsmen, as well as the travelling salesman, often felt sorry for the remittance men, especially the little boy. And she would organise for Induna, the headman, in Gidi, to take an ox wagon down to the Hempson's hut with some mealie milk and a few groceries like tea and sugar, just so they wouldn't starve to death, having blown all their money on booze. On one occasion, possibly at the end of winter, after things had become so dire that they'd run out of food of any kind and were beginning to look emaciated, my grandmother wrote a letter to Billy's family in England, asking them to send money urgently. She told them that it was an emergency, and the family complied. The brothers had some money left over from their payoff, even after their usual drinking orgy at the Notties pub, and they threw a party for their neighbours, inviting our grandparents down to their hut in the wattle plantation. They presented my grandmother with a gift, a large solid brass ashtray in a sort of Art Deco style, which stood on a table in our sitting room for as long as I remember, and is now in our new homestead in the bush at New Forest. It must have cost the Hempsons quite a bit to buy, and have sent up from our nearest town, which was Pietermaritzburg, 50 miles away. And no doubt they must have regretted it the next month when they were broke again, and it would be a long time before they received their next remittance payoff. Some remittance men drifted back to England, but nobody knows what became of Billy Hempson, his brother or the boy. Sometime after the war ended, the Hempsons slipped away, leaving the hut to decay and be reclaimed by wattle saplings. So there you go. There's the remittance men. And next time we're going to be talking about transport riders. Fiona's grandfather, Alan Ross, had several brothers who became transport riders, taking goods by ox wagon from Durban to Johannesburg to supply the burgeoning gold rush there. Now, that's really interesting because, you know, the Strachan & Co. Little supermarkets in Transkei, the two brothers who actually originally set them up in 1874, when they first came to Durban, They arrived in Durban in the 1850s as young men. They weren't even young men, they were about 13 or 14. They were basically orphans. They didn't have their parents with them. They were adopted by an African who later on became a very senior member of their business. But the interesting thing about these two young boys, remember they weren't even teenagers really, they were like, as I say, 13, 14. They became transport riders. They also used to ride from Durban up to Kimberley and also to other parts inland. And that's the way they actually started out. But back in the 1870s, after the Griquas came over the Drakensberg and they settled at Kokstad, Strachan and Co. started setting up these little shops or supermarkets around the Transkei. They eventually had about 24 stores. But in 1874, these two young men released the first indigenous coinage in South Africa, the Strachan and Co. tokens. And I actually have some here, I'll show you. This is what they look like. I mean, they're brass. You can see their hold. You see the hole in the coin. And the reason they hold is because it meant that the Africans, who were their major market, could actually hang them with their beads around their neck. And basically the Africans, or the Zulus who lived in the area, gave these Strachan and Co. tokens the onomatopoeia nickname of Kenjle. Kenjle being the sound that they made when they knocked together while they hung around their necks. Fascinating little story. But that's completely off track. But I thought it was interesting that so many people became transport riders, taking stuff on wagons from Durban up to the inland areas like Kimberley. All right, guys, that's it for this week. Thanks, Fiona. Lovely story. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. And above all, please stay safe. And remember that this video is part of a playlist called The White Zulu. So if you go to my home page and you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see The White Zulu. You can go through all the articles that Fiona has sent me. All right, guys, take care. Bye for now. And don't forget, 8 p.m. tonight, Johannesburg time, I'm going to be talking to Winston. And we've also got another surprise guest coming on as well. But you'll have to be there to find out who it is.